First of all, I think it's worth noticing that in the last number of years we have seen a decrease, a 13% decrease in the number of attacks. Last year, the contest report remarked that there were 11,774 terrorist attacks in 92 countries. And while people may look and say there's a decrease, the reason for that is that the Syrian and the Iraq attacks are decreasing quite significantly. And what we're left with is probably more high-profile and significant attacks in Western Europe. And that's really what concerns all of us, because it's moving from, if you like, a theatre of war into a civilian population, and that's where we are at the moment. There have been a mixture of attacks in Europe over the last number of years, and that's conventional weaponry, such as guns and explosive devices. Multiple attacks, which we've seen in the likes of Paris in recent times. And recently, the use of blunt force weapons. Again, we first saw it with the murder of Fusilier Lee Rigby in London in 2013, and tragically in Nice, where 84 people lost their lives to a vehicle being used. So those weapons are relatively easily got hold of, and that takes us away from the military, the end that you would see in Iraq. Also, so-called lone wolf attacks, such as murder of French police officer Jean-Baptiste Salvang and his partner in June, and the murder of Father Jacques Hamel in July, demonstrate in a horrific way how easily it has become to radicalise individuals, and for them to carry out atrocities without access to traditional military hardware. The availability, indeed the simplicity of such attacks, has shown most graphically, I think, that we'll never find a solution on a purely military basis to this ideology. And those individual attacks are always harder to interrupt or to predict, because there's no intelligence gathering capability a lot of the time with them. But everything that we see in Europe at the minute is rehearsed in Syria and Iraq. The Paris attacks around the stadium were rehearsed in Syria and Iraq as well, when they attacked stadiums there. So I think whenever we look over to those theatres, then we can see potentially what's coming down the lines. And the groupings also learn from each other, and I think from particularly my history with Republican terrorism in Northern Ireland, terrorist groups do learn off each other. So I think there's only a certain amount that they can learn and do, and we see it going round and round. If we look at the prevent and the protect elements of the contest, Northern Ireland has seen the ideologies plunge society into prolonged and deadly conflict, and these resulted in the deaths of thousands of police officers, civilians and soldiers. And there are many lessons which have to be learnt from Northern Ireland. And while times have moved on, and we've seen new threats such as online radicalisation and the targeting of individuals, I think it's still necessary to appreciate that some of the key elements exist which do not radicalise future generations. And the primary things, I think, from my point of view as a police officer, are the need for engagement and the need for the protection of those who are tasked with protecting society. And engagement is imperative to work towards cutting crime. And that's the way that you can actually change lives, and you improve the lives in the deprived areas where a lot of these people come from. Drug, alcohol-related crime, along with violent crime, these are obvious breeding grounds for those who wish to promote the ideology in communities. The police, therefore, in communities need to be visible. They need to be seen to be making a difference in vulnerable communities. And Northern Ireland has seen this as the key to depriving those groupings of the oxygen they need to thrive. Communities do need to have confidence in law and order and not be subjected to a forced overreaction from the state. And this can be manifested in the state imposing draconian laws and policies that more often than not enhance the grip of a terrorist grouping or ideology than that has in the community. And we can see how that manifested itself in West Belfast in the early 1970s, where youths were encouraged to attack the military knowing they would get an overreaction. When the overreaction occurred, that galvanised their position. It's often the aim of the terrorist attacks to force the government into to act in an oppressive manner, and that will in turn isolate communities from law and order. And this invariably makes it harder for them to integrate into the mainstream society. But the police in Northern Ireland had to learn to win back those people who'd been born towards the extremes by addressing not the ideology of the protest groups, but by addressing their narratives and actions which were untrue or criminal. They'd also learned not to feed the social media tiger, So they do that by avoiding arrests at times of disorder and only using force when necessary. And even then, they're ready to justify their actions against a backdrop of policing principles which are headed by the protection of life. And the use of media as a conduit for these storytelling narratives has been going on for years. You know, we go back even into the War of Independence. There was a bulletin called the Irish Bulletin, and it ignored what the IRA did and just gave it instances of the British reaction and that. So the use of social media to promote ideals is also not new. I think it's imperative for police to establish relationships with key persons in all these communities, and that includes the commercial sector, transport, local government and the fellow emergency services. Whenever you come across terrorist crisis such as what I believe we're entering into, you need to know the people you need to know before you need to know them. So you need to get to know people, and you need to get to know them well. Social media, as I said, has also moved on. In Northern Ireland, I think, where we aim to protect our public servants, particularly police officers and soldiers, social media has been used by extremists to publish, if you like, death lists. It's been used to target individuals and will be used to target individuals. It has been used in Northern Ireland to target individuals. People need to learn, particularly people in the public eye, I think, need to learn to not live their lives on social media and be very conscious of what they actually put on social media in relation to their own personal security. Police officers in Northern Ireland are frequently told not to put details of who they are online. And the extremists, again, will look to get fear into society, but I think it's imperative that we give the people who are there to protect society the tools to do the job. They need to be protected. Police officers, and whether it's a police officer or military, need the resourcing and the funding and the initiative to actually be able to make the difference in these areas, because there's no quick wins in engagement in communities. Engaging with communities is a slow business. It takes years of gaining trust. It takes years of working very, very closely with those community leaders. And as I've said earlier there, we have seen in Northern Ireland where that engagement has made a difference. So really, bearing in mind the time constraints for talking, I think that's really what I wanted to cover was the engagement. The additional security precautions, I think, are also need to be ingrained into the psyche of police officers. We look at not setting predictable patterns, not making yourself a target. Emphasis on not talking openly about what you do or about security-related matters, because people are always listening. Your lifestyle, I think they have to take cognizance of who and where you socialise, who you socialise with and where, and the dangers that brings. And protocols as well for police officers dealing with incidents which may be either attempts to murder them or to murder wider members of the community. And I think whenever we put all this together, there is enough expertise in European policing and military circles to be able to have a joined up thinking of best practice on protective security, on how we protect events and how we protect people attending events, particularly where there's masses of people attending, which would be a potential target. So Helga, I don't want to take up any more time of my allotted slot, and if you're happy with that, that'll sort of finish me off, probably in about 6 minutes, 59 seconds. Thank you.